the focus on elections this year, I think, has really reminded all of us of the enormous responsibility that social media platforms have to make sure that they are not contributing to any of the broader harms that we're seeing in many political processes in countries around the world.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Iain Levine. Iain used to work for Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and his current role is with Meta, who run Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and many other tools. Iain's joined by Priyanka Motaparthy, a lawyer, academic, and human rights advocate who teaches at Columbia Law School. 2024 is a year of elections globally. So what responsibility should social media companies have when it comes to addressing and mitigating misinformation and disinformation? You will hear about that in this episode, but first, let's hear from my colleague Salil Tripathi, who spoke to Iain and Priyanka. Salil, this is such a huge challenge for human rights. So why is it important to be talking about this now?
Yeah, this is a very important year because first, there are two major things happening. There are 2 or 3 major conflicts around in the world. We certainly know the one in the Middle East and certainly the one in Ukraine and Russia, but there are other conflicts too, including in Myanmar. But more important than that, this is the epic year for elections. I think by one estimate, something like 4 billion people in the world will probably going to vote in some election, provincial, national, or local. And the big ones are, of course, the ones in the United States. We've already had the one in Bangladesh. Soon there'll be one in Pakistan. Other major countries going to have elections this year include India, South Africa, Russia, whichever way they hold it. Taiwan has already had one too. So these are all going to be votes where people are going to take fundamental decisions about what affect their lives. I shouldn't rule out Britain, of course. Britain also might have an election. It is meant to have an election this year by October. So we are going to have a period of great churn of probably new kinds of leadership, more polarized politics, and probably greater use of electronic media, including artificial intelligence and other tools on the internet, which can distort messages that are being sent out for elections.
And social media companies were under scrutiny in the US Senate late January. Is that right, Salil?
Yes, indeed. They were under a lot of scrutiny and for good reason. It was a Senate hearing and the companies have so far been criticized and for wanting it both ways or in several ways. One, they don't like regulation. Two, they want to retain their own community standards to take down content that might violate those standards. And three, at the same time, they don't want to take on the responsibility of user-generated content. That is what you and I might post on the social media platform. And there's an inherent arbitrariness in those decisions. And the solutions that they have created, automated processes, including outsourcing, content monitoring, and fact-checking, are good, but they have limitations. Most recently, the tech companies have faced criticism for doing not enough or failing to sufficiently protect children online. And in late January, as you just mentioned, the Senate had these hearings at which there was bipartisan criticism of these platforms. And as we'll see in this conversation that we will have, tech companies are facing multiple challenges, including not only protecting vulnerable groups, but it's women, minorities, it's ethnic minorities, LGBT groups, and children, but also in dealing with misinformation and disinformation, which has consequences for public health, as we will see, and also general well-being.
Thanks for framing the conversation we're about to hear. Before we listen to Iain and Priyanka, why was it important or why did you want to speak to Iain or Priyanka particularly?
Both Iain and Priyanka have an amazing record of over 30 or 40 years between them on human rights and defending human rights. Iain has worked with the UN system. He has been senior representative for Amnesty International at the UN, and he had a very senior position at Human Rights Watch. And now he's in a very pivotal position at Facebook and Meta. And as such, he is trying to make sure that the commitments that the company is making to promote, protect, support human rights and the civilized discourse are consistent with international human rights. So it's amazing to have that. Priyanka has an astonishing record on human rights. She has worked on migrant workers. She has worked on Bangladesh. She has worked on conflict and crisis situation. For some time, she was a research fellow with us, and she teaches at a law school on human rights law, conflict, and issues like that. And she has very closely looked at the interface between free speech on one hand and hate speech and violent speech on the other. So we are very lucky to have them talking to us today.
Thanks, Salil, for that background on Iain and Priyanka. Let's hear from both of them then, starting with Priyanka, who talks about the spread of misinformation and disinformation.
So in terms of misinformation and disinformation, it's a huge challenge for us today, both for many of the reasons that you have pointed out, but also I think because of the way in which we consume information these days. The days in which we're sort of picking up a paper that's delivered to our doorstep and reading just one or two or a few sources of information, those are well behind us. All of us are consuming our news online. We're consuming it also from a variety of sources of information. We're reading not just the news outlets in our own country, but countries around the world. And we're also reading news as filtered through voices online, whether that's through X or, still on Facebook or through TikTok or through Instagram. Often we're consuming news directly from people who are involved in situations of armed conflict or who are witnessing it on the ground, citizen journalists, if you will. In one sense, there are many opportunities. We can learn of events directly as they're happening from on-the-ground sources. At the same time, there's a number of risks as well. And I think misinformation and disinformation are chief amongst those. These issues are particularly acute in the setting of armed conflict, where the stakes are particularly high, where there's both a lot of propaganda and a lot of emotions involved. They can be very polarized contexts. People's lives are at stake, their safety, their lands are at stake, and there's a lot of charged narratives being put out into the information environment.
Iain, your thoughts?
As you said, Salil, this is a big year for misinformation, disinformation, partly because of the number of elections that are being held around the world, more than have ever been held in a single year, with I think almost 4 billion people around the world eligible to vote. We have conflicts. And of course, we have the dramatic rise in the development of AI and Gen AI, which creates both enormous opportunities for technological development and many good things, including in human rights, but also enormous risks and anxieties about the ability of Gen AI to create misinformation and disinformation. So very much a critical year for all social media platforms and tech companies, and one which I know we at Meta have been preparing for a long time. These aren't new issues. We've been grappling with misinformation and disinformation and some of the enormous challenges that they create for a long time. Obviously, one of the big challenges is that misinformation is not defined in international human rights law, and it's impossible to write community standards that define misinformation the way we write community standards to define hate speech.
Just to clarify, is it fair to say that misinformation is putting out of information that is not true, but the intent may not be dishonest, whereas with disinformation, the intent is clearly there to manipulate a particular narrative? Is that a fair way for us to understand the two?
I think that is exactly right. Yes,
okay.
Yes. I think disinformation is deliberate. The D is deliberate, and we know, particularly in election contexts and other polarized political contexts, that there will be actors aligned with different political entities who are deliberately putting out information. Other people will be spreading that information genuinely thinking it is legitimate, at which point is this misinformation. But from a human rights perspective, I think it's really important to flag that even though we recognize misinformation, disinformation as being critically important problems with massive human rights implications, we also know that governments around the world abuse the concept of misinformation and disinformation to restrict freedom of expression. And we know of many repressive leaders and political actors around the world who will declare something to be fake news, even though it clearly is not, in an effort to have it discredited or removed. I just want to say a couple of words about some of the human rights implications of misinformation and disinformation, and why does it matter? Why should people not be allowed to say that the earth is flat and to create a flat earth society to bring people together who share the same beliefs? Obviously, that's less of a concern than other kinds of misinformation. But clearly, misinformation, disinformation potentially undermine elections, electoral integrity, and democracy itself. If people are, for example, sharing false information about when elections are taking place or how to register or whether or not one is eligible to vote. If people are circulating false information about whether or not election results are free and fair, they can well undermine the integrity of elections. Misinformation may well threaten the liberty and security of human rights defenders, journalists, and others who may be vilified because they are seeking to put out a correct narrative. And of course, in situations of conflict, misinformation can lead to more violence. If a party to a conflict is claiming that another party to a conflict destroyed a health center, killed civilians, and they circulate an image that comes from a different conflict in a different year, that can well lead to more violence and more threats to human rights. So the stakes are high. I would just say that misinformation, disinformation, for the most part, represent whole of society problems. But clearly, as you both noted, they play out a lot on social media platforms and something that we at Meta and other social media platforms have to be very concerned about.
Now, you used the phrase hate speech when I interrupted you, and I wanted to stay a bit on that because hate speech is commonly understood as the speech people hate rather than the speech that spreads hatred or the speech that incites hatred. But both a question for you, Priyanka, do you think it's useful to make such a distinction? And Iain, to you, about how do you distinguish? Because if someone were to get up and say that all the people of a particular nationality are stupid, that may seem like hate speech, but it's not dangerous. But it would be dangerous if someone were to say, therefore, they should be exterminated or they should be forcibly removed from a country. So I just wanted to unpack those two, Priyanka and then Iain.
Salil, as you said, hate speech isn't meant to encompass speech that we simply don't like, that makes us uncomfortable, or that we disagree with, even if we disagree with it very vehemently or we find it offensive in some way. Hate speech is really meant to encompass speech that is dangerous, that can have a dangerous and violent effect in the real world, and it's said by a person who is in a position of some authority or influence. And so it's meant to be a very restricted category. The freedom of speech is such an important right in our society. It's a way in which we engage in debates with each other, including difficult debates. We have tough conversations. We hear people whose opinions we don't disagree with, even people whose opinions we find offensive. Nevertheless, as a society, we've decided that these are important values to uphold: the impassioned dialogue amongst people who don't agree with each other, and the right to put our views out there. I think at the same time, it's important to be clear-eyed about it because we've seen leaders use coded language. We've seen forms of incitement to violence that, aren't directly telling people to pick up weapons and go out and attack a particular conversation, but within a particular context very clearly mean something like that or have that effect on people. So I think it's important to really look at the context in which this speech is exercised as well.
Iain, your thoughts?
So for us at Meta, in our community standards, we define hate speech as being direct attacks against people on the basis of what we call their protected characteristics. So their race, their ethnicity, their national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on. And we particularly focus on speech that is dehumanizing, speech that casts a particular group of a protected characteristic as being somehow inferior, expressions of contempt or disgust. So we're particularly concerned to ensure that we prevent hate speech that could be linked with offline harm and offline violence. We also want the social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, to be places where people do not feel intimidated or excluded. And we know very well that when we fail to protect people from hate speech, we may well restrict their freedom of expression and their freedom of assembly and association because they feel, in essence, driven away. And we know from research that's been done that women human rights defenders, women journalists, LGBTQ activists, and those from disadvantaged and discriminated against racial and religious minorities may well be more susceptible to being driven away by hate speech and the exclusion intimidation that it creates.
What I want to now come to and try to understand is what are companies actually doing about it. So I know that you have policies. I know you produce a global assessment. You have a kind of Supreme Governing Council or Supreme Court, whatever you want to call it, to look at people who seek redress. But in terms of preventive aspects, what are the specific steps that you would consider given the kind of years we are going to live through?
Obviously, as we've noted, the year is much bigger than the elections, but let me just say perhaps a few words about some of the specific issues or specific things that we're working on around elections, because I think they also help illustrate some of the ways in which we seek to make real and operationalize the human rights policy, which obviously is a big challenge. There are some 3.8 billion monthly users on the platform. So as I think Priyanka noted at the beginning, scale is a dramatic challenge. So a few things perhaps to note. Firstly, the community standards, which I mentioned, I mean, they are sort of the bedrock, because the whole point of the community standards is to navigate from a human rights perspective between freedom of expression and people's ability to express themselves and freedom of access to information, but at the same time to address harmful speech, incitements to violence, bullying and harassment, sexual abuse and exploitation, and other harmful speech. From a specifically misinformation, disinformation perspective, hugely important parts of our work are our relationships with the third-party fact checkers. And we work very closely with well over 100 third-party fact checkers around the world in, I think it's about 60 plus languages now, to assess potential misinformation and disinformation, and to take action where that misinformation or disinformation is potentially going to lead to imminent physical harm or to undermine political processes, including elections. We have hundreds of trusted partners around the world, normally civil society groups, with whom we engage to track context. Our community standards are global, but their implementation obviously has to be contextualized to a particular situation, the likelihood that certain kinds of speech may contribute to real world harm. Around political ads, obviously political parties and candidates spend enormous amounts of money on social media ads. We have very strict standards that relate to prohibiting ads, for example, that discourage voting, ads that question the legitimacy of elections, ads that have premature claims of victory. And we've also introduced, beginning this year, new rules about ads that include artificial intelligence generated materials, partly as a way of addressing this issue of spread of misinformation and disinformation. In the lead up to elections, Meta bringing together people with all sorts of different kinds of expertise, regional expertise in human rights and obviously on the engineering and product side, to ensure that we're assessing risks, that we're engaging with human rights defenders and activists, and that we're creating fora to ensure that we are coming together to respond quickly to unfolding events, and seeking to ensure that we protect the rights of all users in those countries, and that we address potential spread of misinformation and disinformation. We may remove it, or we may link to credible information. So, for example, if somebody is spreading misinformation on dates of election for how to register for election processes, we will seek to share information, providing authoritative information, which is usually linked to information provided by national electoral authorities, so that people are not distracted from the truth about how to vote, how to register.
Priyanka, what more can be done beyond what Iain has set up as what Meta would be doing? As someone who watches these things with concern and has worked in fairly difficult environments,
I mean, first of all, I just want to say a few words about why it's so important to check misinformation and disinformation. We've spoken about these issues in the context of elections, a bit in the context of armed conflict, but really, more broadly speaking, information is the gateway through which we access so many other rights. So we can look back, for example, to the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when so much misinformation and disinformation was spreading about how to access vaccines and their efficacy. And there was a whole range of medical misinformation and disinformation that impacted people's right to health and their right to life. In terms of what companies can do, There have been a lot of recommendations around transparency. So it's very important that companies are transparent about their content moderation policies, as well as the tools they use to flag content, how content is either flagged or removed or shown or not shown to users. Really transparency around how information is regulated and how misinformation and disinformation is either kept in check or, allowed to flourish. But, what are the policies and rules regulating that different companies implement? I think the second component is due diligence. Of course, all companies have an obligation to undertake human rights due diligence. So are companies merely, are sitting back and receiving reports, or are they proactively gathering information about a particular context in which they anticipate risk and understanding how prospectively their role and their platforms might be used to create risky conditions for individuals or groups? I think the last element really relates to leadership. There really needs to be an investment in human rights protections from the company's side. There need to be teams that are large enough and resources in place to deal with issues as they arise.
I just want to agree with everything she just said. Transparency, due diligence, leadership are critical. Saying as much as we possibly can about our community standards, about how we enforce them, about election preparations, are important. And we are seeking to provide information, to do briefings of stakeholders, human rights activists and others, to make sure that they understand the work that's being done. I mean, even just being part of this discussion, is an important contribution, hopefully, to being more transparent and explaining what we're doing. I'm really happy that Priyanka's talked about due diligence, because it's something I should have talked about earlier. Under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as a company, it's vital that we know and show a human rights impact. And to know it, we have to do the due diligence. We have to assess the most salient human rights risks that are faced by our users and others who may be impacted by our products. We have to think about scale and scope and severity and likelihood of those risks. So doing both comprehensive salient risk assessment, which is something that we did last year and published in our human rights report, but obviously more country-specific human rights risks assessments to understand potential risks ahead of elections. Who are those most likely to be impacted? What are the kinds of human rights risks? Is it misinformation, disinformation? Is it hate speech? Is it something else? It's a critical part of us being able to prioritize resources, prioritize the allocation of third-party fact-checking capacities, or engaging with more trusted partners, or deploying more experts, content moderators, people on the product side. And then obviously it's vital that we track the risks that we've identified through due diligence, that we track the impact of the measures that are taken to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And lastly, on leadership, absolutely agree. It's vital that this work not just be seen as the work of a human rights team or a trust and safety team, but it be seen as a commitment from the company. And you may have noticed, and I think it was end of November last year, Nick Clegg, President for Global Affairs, issued a press release sort of outlining the elections preparations that we were taking. And I think that was important. He didn't necessarily say anything dramatically different from what hasn't already been said in other places, but the fact that it came from him sent a signal that there is high-level recognition that this really matters.
So, Iain, what are the practical difficulties you have in doing what you want to do? Is it internal in terms of resources, or is it external in terms of expectations of the society, or is it the states in which you operate, political environment? I'm sure it's a combination of everything.
It's a great question. I think you've flagged a lot of the key issues. I think, the high-profile nature of social media platforms, and I can't speak, and I won't speak for others, but I know from informal conversations I've had with colleagues in other platforms that they, for the most part, they share, I think, the same sense of responsibility and sometimes anxiety as we face elections. I think expectations are very high, and as I said previously, misinformation and disinformation reflect to a very large extent an erosion of social cohesion, which we have seen in many, many countries around the world, including here in the US, where I am based, but not only. And that's the sense of the loss of faith and confidence in fact, truth and objectivity, which we particularly saw manifested during, obviously, the COVID pandemic. another misinformation, disinformation about COVID and where it came from and how it was spread, I think just illustrate the intensity and the depth of the lack of trust in authorities that so many people around the world have, which creates such a fertile ground for misinformation, disinformation. So that I think provides a hugely important context for us. And then, yes, it's tracking situations in many different parts of the world and ensuring that we seek to live up to the global standards that we have created and the global mechanisms that we're seeking to create, but recognize the importance of contextualized interpretation and enforcement. Obviously, there are countries in the world where governments are very much looking to exploit misinformation, disinformation to restrict freedom of speech. We also know, and we have phenomenon which we call coordinated inauthentic behavior, when we have paid trolls and entities which are deliberately seeking to spread misinformation, disinformation in their own countries or in countries around the world as ways of undermining the legitimacy of elections and potentially encouraging particular political trends or political candidates. And so a phenomenal range of issues and challenges that we face. But I think what's encouraging is that the focus on elections this year, I think, has really reminded all of us of the enormous responsibility that social media platforms have to make sure that they are not contributing to any of the broader harms that we're seeing in many political processes in countries around the world.
Yeah, I think there are two or three very interesting points that have come from what you just said. One is, of course, this coordinated interference, because very often it is not even due to an ideological commitment, but purely on mercenary grounds, where people are hired to act as troll factories. That took place in the US elections in 2016 is a good example of that. And Priyanka, I'm so glad you mentioned the COVID aspect, because it's not just about elections and it's not about conflict. And Iain, I'm so glad you mentioned the trust, because this is all happening because of lack of trust in authority. Now, collectively, the three of us have probably about 40, 50 years of experience in human rights issues. And we've always been taught and learned and ingrained and believed and treated as an article of faith that the primary obligation rests with the state. And yet, in our entire conversation so far, we haven't said anything about the state, except the fact that the states are holding elections. And Iain, you rightly pointed out that national election commissions have to, their information you can disseminate more widely, but they can be bent institutions. They can be crooked institutions too. So, Priyanka, my first question to you, what does this absence of state signify, and what do we need to do? What kind of a mechanism? And Iain, as someone who has to comply with the law, what kind of coalitions do you see emerging so that we can get things on the right path?
Before answering your question, I think it's helpful to just lay out the range of behavior that we're dealing with. You mentioned the troll factories, but when we speak about misinformation and disinformation, we're dealing with everything from a sort of like low tech or unsophisticated an intervention is merely, using photographs or video from a prior conflict to, and saying it's from a current one, or using photos from one context and labeling them from another one, all the way up to, AI-enabled deepfakes, where you have a world leader, other significant person in a position of authority appearing to say or give a speech that they did not, in fact, say. So really, manufacturing not just information, but, the appearance of credibility. And that goes a long way to destroying trust in what we see with our eyes and hear with our ears. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you also have situations in which people label true information as false. So saying that a true scene was in fact staged by actors. So there's a whole range of different interventions that we're speaking about. In terms of the absence of the state, I think this is an area in which we're really seeing the state, in one sense, recognizing that it has an important role to play, but in another sense, really struggling to catch up with both the scale and the nature of the problem. And, there have been statements from high-level policymakers saying that they're reluctant to regulate tech platforms, and particularly new developments or, new tools, because they don't want to stifle innovation and they don't want to sort of crack down on very profitable elements of the market. But at the same time, because there are such significant human rights implications here, there is there's a very important role for regulators to play, whether that's, banning the use of tools in a certain context, where they've been proven to be regularly and particularly harmful, or, exercising a strong oversight function to understand the impacts and imposing penalties.
Iain?
Let me emphasize three critically important factors. The first is that governments obviously have an obligation to protect freedom of expression. That means, in this context, obviously, the freedom of expression of users of social media platforms who should be able to express themselves, their views and opinions about elections, about candidates, and about parties and the platforms they stand on. And also, it's vital that governments respect the freedom of expression of all candidates, including opposition candidates, the freedom of expression of journalists who are reporting on election campaigns, and of human rights defenders and others, to ensure that the elections are conducted in an environment where all are able to express themselves and ultimately all are able to freely and in an informed way choose the candidates they want to support. The second, I think, critical obligation that governments have is to ensure that they are conducting free and fair elections. That means that they have to do all that is necessary to enable people to vote, to enable people to register to vote, that they provide authoritative information and credible information about where and how to vote and where and how elections are taking place, is that the processes by which election results are announced are understood and make it hard for people to undermine the legitimacy of the electoral process. And the third question is around, as Priyanka mentioned earlier, the importance of regulation of social media companies and tech companies, but regulations that are rights respected. And we are seeing enormous developments around the world with regulations for tech companies, but it's vital to ensure that those regulations are rights respecting and are not used by governments as an excuse to repress or silence the speech of those who seek to be active on social media platforms.
Thank you so much, Iain and Priyanka. This is not an easy year. It's a difficult one. And as we have noticed, as we talk about, it's not just about politics and it's not just about conflict, but it affects with many issues. It deals with trust in media, trust in leadership, trust in established institutions such as governments and companies. In all these areas, we have to keep having a scrutiny on what's happening, always be watchful, always seek accountability. So, Iain, we wish you well. It's going to be a difficult year. We will be watching as critical friends and perhaps have another conversation later in the year.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Salil, for having us.
Huge thanks to Iain and Priyanka for this fascinating discussion. It will be interesting to see how democracy is protected online this year. So, Salil, if there are three things to take away from this episode, what will they be?
It's always hard to summarize something as complex as this into three takeaways, right? But let me try. One is that we ought to recognize that elections require transparency and information. But information is not just restricted to what happens during an electoral process, but even otherwise. We've just emerged from, and we are probably going to go again into another bout of the COVID-19 pandemic. And at that time, a lot of misinformation, and some of it was deliberate, and therefore disinformation was being spread about access to vaccine, their efficacy, whether one should use them, how the whole virus spread, and so on. And all this is noise, which ends up interfering with people's right to health, right to information, and right to life and livelihood. So to that extent, information is a gateway, and it matters not just in conflict situations, but otherwise. So that's an extremely important part for us to know, and especially in terms of what it means for companies in terms of their responsibility to ensure that truth is allowed unfiltered, and they have systems in place to moderate the content so that we make sure that the right information is in the hands of people who need that. So that's one part that we certainly need to know. The second part is due diligence. How does a company get around this? And it can get around this and get grip of these issues if it has a rigorous due diligence process. That means anticipating the risk, taking steps to mitigate them, and having grievance mechanism in place, incentivizing good behavior, and making sure that bad behavior is disincentivized and mitigated and eliminated, and being public and transparent about the policies and being fair and consistent. All that it's part of the due diligence framework. And I think that becomes crucial too. And finally, we all live in a very risky environment. It is an environment where violent risks are possible. Minorities are going to be subject to insults and ridicule. People are going to be prevented from speaking. Deep fakes are likely to emerge, which are going to distort reality as we understand it. So the role of the company to ensure that what gets out from its portals, from its pipelines, from its information channels is increasingly harder, it's more difficult, and it also reinforces the need for good human rights protection to be embedded and with great consultation with civil society. And it does mean much more resources and many more people within the companies themselves to make sure that these things are properly implemented.
Thank you, Salil. You've been listening to Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you'll never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.